Origins of Japan by D.W. Draffin. I am paddling a boat south, following the Pacific shorelines of Northeast Asia, 37,000 years ago. My people come from the north, following the bounties that the coasts provide, from where I was born on a landmass connected to the Asian continent, which will someday be the Sakhalin Islands. We have fled to this frontier land of Japan. My family is with me. We all travel together. This ice age has lowered global sea levels, and the land bridges that connect Japan to the mainland have closed off northern access to its inland sea. So we stay to the outer shores, facing the infinity of the great ocean. We are on the run. Once, we meet a group much like ourselves, but we approach with great caution. We have been evicted from every spot we have so far tried to call home, but even here the land has already been claimed. This new group are on land at the water's edge, gathering clams and mussels for a great feast. They have just felled a bison and share its meat with us in celebration. We contribute fish and squid, and regard our hosts over the light of their cooking fires. We have not seen people like this before. Our heritage derives from Central Asia and the Amur River of Siberia. Our ancestors migrated across Northeast Asia to its coasts, where we learned the secrets of the sea. But these folk have traveled over the ages through the jungles of Southeast Asia, and their ancestors have traversed the Ryukyu Islands by boat, following the chain up from Taiwan to the northeast, where they have long been settled in Kyushu. With sign language, we learned that they are prosperous hunters in a landscape rich with game. They will not protest if we stay. So, we settle here on the shores. We meet other fisherfolk paddling up the coast from the south. We encounter nomadic hunters whose ancestors crossed from the Korean peninsula. We all look very different. We all speak different languages and practice different religions. Over the years, we intermarry and quarrel. We become enemies and enslave each other. And then our ancient enmities fade, and eventually we become one people. Mine are just the most recent of many immigrant waves who have come here to make a life for ourselves at the edge of the world. The Japan of today is an archipelago entirely surrounded by water, famously isolated and inward-looking. For thousands of years now, it has hosted its own cultures, and its major waves of immigration are so distant that they have been lost to time. But migrations they certainly had. Waves of newcomers appeared throughout the Pleistocene, credibly dated to begin 37,000 years ago, when our refugee boat people in the Prologue arrived. But the academic study of Japan's earliest history has only begun in earnest over the last few generations. Why? Several factors delayed the development of the field. First, the mostly volcanic soils of Japan are acidic, and they dissolve bones, DNA samples, and other fossils, leaving no clear archaeological record. Second, the unified modern or Yamato culture of Japan, which stretches back thousands of years, has traditionally claimed that one of the pillars of its identity is the belief that the Japanese emerged, fully formed, on their island nation, and that their line of emperors dates back directly to the first gods of their cosmology, and specifically Amaterasu, the sun goddess. Migrants from beyond the horizon do not significantly figure in their founding myths. So strong is this continuing belief in a divine origin that in the spring of 2024, Princess Aiko took a formal trip to the reputed tomb of Emperor Jinmu outside of Nara, which traditionalists consider the founder of her royal house, whose reign began in 660 BCE. Yet, no historical documentation exists about the first 10 emperors, and the dates of their rules are considered by academics to be based on evolving oral traditions and most likely conjecture, to say nothing of their descent from gods and goddesses. Regardless, early Japanese archaeologists would dig no deeper than stratigraphic layers dated to 15,000 BCE because they assumed there could be nothing older than that to be found. That all changed in 1947 when Tadahiro Aizawa, a natto peddler and stone collector in Iwajuku, discovered a microlith, then an arrowhead, then a whole array of stone implements that have been dated as old as 25,000 years. After much early resistance from the academics of the time, these discoveries eventually touched off a frenzy of archaeology that has now identified over 15,000 Pleistocene sites in Japan. I can't help but wonder how the religion and mythology of Japan might differ if their soils had not disintegrated all the easily identifiable records of their past. The geology of our landscapes informs our culture to a remarkable degree. How might the ethnogenesis of Japan be different if those Pleistocene land bridges had never connected it to the mainland, or if they had never been submerged? Large-scale genetic studies are finally providing results to these questions of early Japan, although in most cases they are only inspiring further questions. Perhaps only now are the conclusions well enough confirmed that it is safe to say that the linear and monolithic cultural beliefs of traditional Japan have been embroidered beyond recognition by historians, archaeologists, linguists, and geneticists into a much richer tapestry of immigrations, admixtures, and influences of distant human populations from nearly every corner of Asia. The most recent of these genetic studies is a new database known as JEWEL, or the Japanese Encyclopedia of Whole Genome Exome Sequencing Library. A broad, multi-institutional effort, this whole genome sequencing dataset sampled 3,256 individuals from across Japan to create a high-resolution, fine-grained glimpse into the movement of early peoples and the human development of various regions in Japan. These samples were categorized by their geography, broken down into 7 general regions: Hokkaido, north; Tohoku, northeast; Kanto, east; Chubu, central; Kansai, west; Kyushu, south; and Okinawa. Their conclusions have further confirmed a growing consensus that indicates the Japanese ethnic identity is made of not one single ancestry, nor even 2, such as the dual cluster model of the Hondo mainland and the Ryukyu cluster, which was commonly believed for decades. Now the models that researchers construct show that 3 major migrations of ethnically diverse Homo sapiens, along with numerous minor ones, have created the modern people of Japan. It was long believed that the earliest identifiable culture, the Jomon, were a single unified ethnicity that arose among nomadic Pleistocene hunter-gatherer populations on the Japanese archipelago around 14,000 BCE. Named for the cord-marked style of pottery they produced, theirs are considered among the world's earliest examples of pottery, and their artifacts have been found all over Japan and the Ryukyu island chain, indicating that the Jomon created a unique culture over thousands of years across nearly the entire archipelago. Yet, herein lies another early assumption that has been contradicted by geneticists. The Jomon may have possessed a unified culture, but they did not, in fact, derive from a single genetic lineage. They were themselves an admixture of many waves of immigration, stretching back to the arrival of the first modern humans in East Asia. The wide variety of genotypes gradually fused into the Jomon culture, creating its own distinct ethnic identity after perhaps 20,000 years or more. The Jewel Survey also detects a host of archaic genetic variants, including both Denisovan and Neanderthal heritage, with genetic markers for such things as height and sensitivity to semaglutide-based drugs, a family of pharmaceuticals that includes Wegovy and Ozempic. Studies have been proposed to see if these populations, with a higher percentage of archaic genetics, might have a different reaction to these classes of drugs. The Jomon survived the Ice Ages and thrived afterward in the relatively moderate and temperate archipelago, from the snowy north of Hokkaido to the tropical Pacific island chains off Kyushu's south coast. And they developed simple arboreal agricultural practices in tandem with hunting and gathering, a kind of plant husbandry that did not rise to the level of tilling fields or planting crops. They tended the many species of trees that provided squash, beans, and nuts. They also cultivated lacquer trees, a development that led to the earliest examples of lacquer in the world, from the Kameda Peninsula of Hokkaido. The presence of lacquer, as well as clay, animal, and goddess figurines at Jomon sites, is widespread. Today, in the north of Japan, the modern Ainu people still represent the legacy of these earliest Japanese peoples. Autosomal DNA indicates that they are the most closely related to the ancient Jomon, with over 50% of their genetic makeup unique to themselves and their archaic lineage. They are also related to an ancient people of northern Honshu, known in historical accounts as the Emishi. The name was given to them by others and means shrimp barbarians. But it is a mistake to think that this refers to their primary food source. Shrimp instead refers to the long, spiky whiskers, such as shrimp have. The Chinese called them Maoren, the hairy people. The Emishi most likely arose from among the Zoku-jomon in the 7th century CE and are related to the Satsumon people who followed in the region. But the Zoku-jomon, the Emishi, and the Satsumon have all been absorbed into the wider Yamato Japanese ethnicity, as have nearly all others, save the Ainu in the north and the Ryukyuan peoples of the south. Centered in Okinawa, the Ryukyuan ethnicity remains officially unrecognized in Japan. They and the Ainu have faced the challenges of many indigenous populations across the world over the last few centuries, with policies designed to absorb them into the homogeneous majority population and determined attempts to erase their culture. Most closely related genetically to the South Jomon, the Ryukyuan peoples have their own cuisine, language, religion, and cultural traditions. In fact, Okinawan restaurants are my favorite in Japan. Their meals can be spicy and full-flavored, a unique tropical seafood version of East Asian dishes. The Jomon were implicated for a time in the peopling of the Americas. Models existed of their passage further north, up along the Kamchatka Peninsula and Beringian coasts. But recent genetic studies contradict these models and show that they were not major contributors to the early populations of North or South America. A recent paper does indicate, however, that ancient populations of East Asians, including some Jomon, possess traces of DNA that most likely came back from the Americas. This implies that the ancient waves of migration were never just a one-way street, and that the intermixture of populations over tens of thousands of years is far more complex than we thought. Around 3,000 years ago, some researchers claim that the earliest changes to the Jomon landscape can start to be found in the archaeological record of Honshu, central Japan. Most scholars remain unconvinced, however, and still point to a date perhaps 700 years later when this new movement is unmistakable. New styles of pottery appear across the region, as well as improved carpentry techniques and the production of wet rice in paddies. The Yayoi have arrived. They are the beginning of a new wave of migration from mainland Asia that transforms the entire Japanese archipelago and eventually relegates the Jomon to the geographical and cultural fringes of the country. Also known as the Wajin, the Yayoi are another ethnicity that appeared simple and monolithic at first, and now are revealed to be a much more intricately composed identity than imagined. Parts Han Chinese, Proto-Korean, Southeast Asian, and Jomon. They arrived in Japan as initially both hunter-gatherers and early farmers, somewhat indistinguishable from the preceding populations, most likely filling the islands of Japan over several documented and undocumented waves that began as early as 1000 BCE and culminated in a dominant period from 300 BCE to 300 CE. There have been many attempts over the years to align the arrival of the Yayoi with the wider events of documented East Asian history. For example, there are those who claim the Chinese explorer and alchemist Xu Fu, who was sent by Qin Shi Huang, emperor and founder of the Qin dynasty, into the eastern seas in search of the elixir of life, was the true founder of the Yayoi. He sailed with 60 ships filled with soldiers and craftsmen, and 3,000 boys and 3,000 girls, seeking the secrets of immortality. It is tempting to imagine this legendary figure and his odd expedition laying the foundations of modern Japan. Their second mission departed from the Chinese mainland into the Pacific in 210 BCE and never returned. Who knows? They may indeed have contributed to the establishment of Yayoi culture, or the armada may have been entirely lost at sea. The problem with this most fantastical of origin stories is that the initial elements of Yayoi culture had most likely already been introduced for centuries before Xu Fu may have arrived, and the estimated 4 million inhabitants of Japan at the time would have almost certainly absorbed this migration, regardless of how charming the children were or how powerful his alchemy was, without adopting the language of the newcomers or many other cultural traits. Others like to point to the massive exodus from the fall of the Chinese Empire that occurred in the 5th century BCE. The partition of Jin began what is known as the Warring States period of China, which led to massive upheavals and waves of refugees as the various kingdoms fought for supremacy over the following 300 years. But once again, despite the possibly great numbers of immigrants who must have brought with them their language and traditions and culture, the Proto-Japonic languages the Yayoi brought to the archipelago remained unrelated to Chinese, and the indigenous religions remained dominant throughout this period. Yet others call the Yayoi the Sea People, arguing that they arrived from somewhere in the Pacific to the east. But unlike other models that show them crossing from the mainland, the Sea People's theory possesses no such proof. It is interesting to note, though, that the Yayoi people who arrived in Itazuke in northern Kyushu after crossing the Sea of Japan from the Korean peninsula are not genetically related to the Koreans of today. The ancestors of modern Koreans inhabited the Korean peninsula after the Yayoi, pushing them out to the east. Both peoples probably originated further west. So those who like to identify the Yayoi as some true kernel of Japanese identity see their progress across Central Asia and Korea into Japan as a significant event, something like the way Aryans have become a mythic identifier of superior ethnicity in South Asia and Europe. but it is just as incorrect here, and once again, the Yayoi are not so easily defined. While initial Yayoi crafts resemble those of the Jomon, with their pottery also coiled and impressed with cords, the newcomers soon introduce bronze vessels, and by the end of their period, iron implements. A story from this era is still widely known in modern Japan. It begins with Emperor Suinin asking the legendary fighter Nomi no Sukune to put a rival chieftain, Taima no Kahaya, in his place, after the latter had boasted that he was the strongest man under the heavens. Nomi no Sukune broke the upstart's ribs with a kick and shattered his back with another, killing him. And thus, sumo wrestling was born. With an increasing population come agricultural settlements, social stratification, and the division of labor. Chinese accounts tell of Yayoi chiefs at this time, whom they called the Wo, bearing tattoos that indicate their social position. Textiles become more refined, buildings of wood and stone appear, and Yayoi grain storage becomes common to survive increasingly harsh winters and droughts that leave behind Jomon remains that are shorter and weaker, clear signs of malnutrition. The Yayoi also built earthen mounds for the dead, the most notable of which is the Tatasuki burial mound located in Kurashimi in the south of Honshu. Based on the presence of nearby earthenware shards, the site has been dated to the late 2nd to early 3rd century CE and may hold the remains of the rulers of the kingdom of Kibi, who rose to power in the region at that time. It is important to note that there is no history being recorded yet because there are no writing systems in Japan. All the historical documentation that exists from this time period comes from China. So we possess only brief glimpses of the island and its collective nations before the 6th century CE. The Chinese depict the land of Wo during the Yayoi period as being populated by hundreds of scattered independent settlements, often fighting among themselves. Emerging from these local conflicts, multiple power centers develop, especially in the south and west of the archipelago. Himiko, Queen of the Yamatai, attested to in Chinese documents entitled Records of the Three Kingdoms, written during her reign around 220 CE, state, "The country formerly had a man as ruler. For some 70 or 80 years after that there were disturbances and warfare. Thereupon the people agreed upon a woman for their ruler. Her name was Himiko. She occupied herself with magic and sorcery, bewitching the people. Though mature in age, she remained unmarried. She had a younger brother who assisted her in ruling the country. After she became the ruler, there were few who saw her. She had 1,000 women as attendants, but only one man. He served her food and drink and acted as a medium of communication. She resided in a palace surrounded by towers and stockades, with armed guards in a state of constant vigilance." The Yamatai compete with other local kingdoms and countries for supremacy in the region over the following centuries. The various population centers are protected by city walls and moats and castles. Their leaders aspire to greater and greater titles. Mythologies are documented that place Japan in the center of the world, such as the Kamitsumaki stories that will someday be documented in the Kojiki, Japan's first book, 7 centuries later. Funerary practices become ever more ornate to reinforce these social traditions, and this is when the Kofun Period begins. Named for the gigantic, keyhole-shaped burial mounds which begin to appear in both Japan and parts of the Korean peninsula, The Kofun Period begins around 300 CE and lasts for over 200 years. Over 160,000 Kofun have been identified from this era. Some are enormous, like the Hashihaka Kofun in Nara, which was 278 meters long, 150 meters wide, and rose 30 meters above the ground. It is believed to be a tribute to Princess Yamato Totohi Momoso, daughter of Emperor Korei, seventh of the legendary emperors. This period ushers in the first historically documented era in Japan. The southern half of the archipelago becomes dominated by the Yayoi tradition. Some scholars see the Yamatai as a direct predecessor of the Yamato kingdom in Kinai, but others place the throne of Himiko elsewhere in central Japan. The Yamatai kingdom is no longer mentioned by the Chinese, and many details about it, including its exact geographical location, fade into obscurity and remain a matter of great dispute. Although its importance is absent from the historical record, genetic studies have suggested that the third Great Migration from the mainland to Japan occurred during the Kofun Period. The Jewel genetic study further confirms it. In summary, its authors state, "Our data suggested that the Japanese population could be best modeled by admixtures of three ancestral components. We found that the proportions of Okinawa and Northeast ancestries are correlated with geographic longitude. Previous studies have suggested that Japanese carry Jomon and East Asian ancestry, represented by Han Chinese. Recently, the presence of Northeast Asian ancestry has been proposed on the basis of analyses of ancient genomes. Our results indicated a significantly closer relationship between West and ancient Chinese groups around the Yellow River region, specifically in the Middle Neolithic and Late Neolithic periods. In contrast, individuals of Northeast showed significantly higher genetic affinities with Jomon and ancient Koreans from the Three Kingdoms period, 4th to 5th century CE. These results align with reports indicating that ancient Japanese in the Yayoi period and certain ancient Korean groups had a high proportion of Jomon ancestry. Multiple lines of evidence suggest that Okinawa and the Northeast may be linked to Jomon and East Asian ancestries. Although less clear, the ancestral origins of the West could potentially be connected to ancient populations in Japan and the Korean peninsula. This elusive third wave from the Kofun era contributes 71% of the modern genetic Japanese profile. Although more study needs to be done to properly identify its origins, reading between the lines in this and other recent studies, there's an implication that the key lies in the Kansai West and its long-standing connection to the Korean peninsula and the Han Chinese. But now, researchers add to these lineages a very strong Northeast Asian component. Further back, the valleys of southern Siberia and the Altai Mountains of Central Asia cultivated early human genotypes 50,000 years ago, and they radiated outward in waves that displaced the archaic populations of Europe, South Asia, and the Far East. The essential genetic ancestry of Japan originates in this Central Asian cauldron, whether it is the earliest Proto-jomon, arriving 40,000 years ago, or refugees from 300 CE, chased by warring factions in China across the inland sea. These are the three great migrations of Japan's history, each introducing a new phase: the Jomon with foraging, the Yayoi with agriculture, and the Kofun with state building. During this era, in the far north and south of the archipelago, the Jomon still observe their ancient ways. But the emperors of Yamato arise from the endless conflicts, gaining land and subjects from competing warlords. At least we think they do. The two chronicles that have always been considered historical documents in Japan that describe the early days of the country and its legendary Yamato emperors are the aforementioned Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, both of which were written hundreds of years after the events they describe. The first 10 Yamato rulers are known as the legendary emperors, and they are generally only given the briefest biographical details, such as birth name, regal name, and dates. The stories that are recorded in these books come from ancient oral traditions, which is all the Japanese had until now. But this all changes in 538 CE with the arrival of a gift from a Korean king. Seong of Baekje is one of the earliest proponents of Buddhism in East Asia, importing scholars and texts from India to spread the word of the new religion. His gift of Buddhist statues to the Yamato Emperor Kinmei divides the Japanese court, and his closest counselors bitterly disagree over the path ahead. The Soga clan are devoted to Buddhism, and the Mononobe clan reject it and uphold the Proto-Shinto traditions of the country's past. They convince the emperor to give the Buddhist gifts away as a compromise. His senior advisor, Soga no Iname, builds a temple for the statues and texts for safekeeping. But this is more than his rival Mononobe no Okoshi can bear. Finally, persuading the emperor to reject Buddhism entirely, the Mononobe clan has the new Buddhist temple of the Soga burned to the ground and the statues destroyed. These two legendary clans will come into conflict again and again over the following centuries as their descendants find ever more reasons to compete for ultimate power. But, despite the efforts of the traditionalists, Buddhism prevails over the following century, finding a place within Japan alongside Shinto, a syncretic process called Shinbutsu Shugo. The animist structure of the old religion, with its worship of kami, or local spirits, becomes informed with the philosophies of the new Indian import, creating a Buddhist tradition unique to Japan. Just as importantly, the arrival of Buddhism also brings the first writing system to the country, and they begin to document their own culture for the first time, making Emperor Kinmei, the 29th emperor, the first historically attested emperor by contemporary sources in Japanese history. Horyuji Temple is built in 607 CE and then rebuilt after a fire in 670. It remains not only the oldest building still standing in Japan, but the oldest wooden structure anywhere in the world. Dedicated to the Buddha of healing, Yakushi Nyorai, the temple's construction is ordered by Prince Shotoku, a legendary figure whose memory is venerated by a cult for over 1,000 years. A close ally of the Soga, Prince Shotoku does all he can to defeat their rivals the Mononobe clan and promote Buddhism in Japan. In 649 CE, the Empress Kogyoku is hosting a Korean delegation at the palace. Little does she know that the blood of one of the most powerful men in the country is about to be spilled. It is the latest powerful figure of the Soga clan, sitting in his place among the courtiers, Soga no Iruka. No longer content to be the standard-bearers of Buddhism and senior advisors to emperors, Iruka and his father Soga no Emishi have begun building their own palaces and fortresses in a bid to rival the emperor's power. But the loyal Soga no Kureyamada no Ishikawa no Maro, whose son-in-law and ally, Prince Naka no Oe, would someday become Emperor Taijin, strikes during the court ceremony. It is the prince himself who attacks Iruka, wounding him severely before being restrained. The empress withdraws, and Oe's retinue finishes off the upstart Soga leader. Known as the Ishii incident, it spells doom for the powerful Soga clan. In payment for his loyalty to the throne, Soga no Kurayamada no Ishikawa no Maro is convicted of treason. He dutifully strangles himself, and his entire clan is exterminated. Their palaces are burned, and the illustrious Soga vanish from history. After the fall of the Soga, the last independent power centers in Japan fall under the dominion of the 36th Yamato Emperor Kotoku. He enacts the Taika reforms, broad changes to the island nation to concentrate power further into imperial hands and unify the country once and for all. In 600 CE, the emperor sends the first official Japanese delegation to the Chinese Tang dynasty court to study its traditions and doctrines. On their return, the new knowledge that they bring inspire the reforms, which change land ownership policies and the basic structure of the empire, taking possession of the traditional landowner estates and dividing the land into a Tang-inspired Ritsuryo state of 66 imperial provinces and 592 counties. Confucianism and the Chinese written language are also introduced, as well as Taoism, as indicated by the octagonal structures the Kofun nobility begin to be buried in. A uniform legal code is established throughout the nation, ancestral titles are banned for nearly all clans, and a strong vertical structure to the Japanese political system is enacted, from the emperor on down. In 710 CE, the capital of this unified Japanese empire is moved to Nara, where it remains for less than 100 years. During this Nara period, the country's culture continues to be codified, as well as its past. This is when the two books, the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, are written. Based on oral traditions, they provide Japanese culture an unbroken lineage for the Yamato emperors that extends back to the dawn of time. In 794 CE, the capital is moved to Heian-kyo, modern-day Kyoto, by the 50th Emperor Kamu, and there it remains until 1868. This Heian period, the last of the Japanese classical periods, consolidates not only political power, but also the wider identity of Japan into the Heian court. Minorities are further suppressed. The first shogun, or general, to be sent against the Emishi barbarians of the north, Otomo no Otomaro, subjugates them and brings Tohoku and Hokkaido more firmly under imperial control. The early Heian culture engages closely with China, impressed by the marvels of the Tang dynasty. But this does not last. Even after they have embraced the written language of China, as well as many of their philosophies and religions, Japanese language and culture remain separate. This trend intensifies during the later Heian period, when the first Japanese kana syllabary writing system is developed, which lead to literary achievements such as the Tale of Genji and the Pillow Book. The official state visits of Japanese scholars and diplomats to China end in the 9th century as the Wang Chao rebellion nearly topples the Tang dynasty. Facing a loss of access to China and its exports leads Japan to become even more consumed with its own cultural traditions and identity. In the later Heian period, the empire falls into decline. Despite its name, Heian means peace. Power politics plague the court, and its rulers are more concerned with the artistic and cultural achievements mentioned above than governing an increasingly restive domain. Emperors and empresses depend more and more on their subordinates to effectively run the government, and the Fujiwara clan from Tohoku in the north and the Tachibana, descendants of Prince Shotoku, become indispensable extensions of the imperial court, ruling the country in all but name by the end of the period. The Ritsuryo order is corroded by the self-interest of the great clans, and they develop a feudal system based on their shoen, or manors, with independent tax bases and serf populations. The center, as they say, cannot hold, and the loss of security across the land leads to the rise of the warrior, or samurai, class. The constant warfare against the emishi in the north develops a deep military tradition which leads to increasing power for the shogun generals. A few emperors are able to forestall the advances of the Fujiwara clan, but by 1000 CE, they are the true powers of Japan, installing their loyalists on the throne and removing those who challenge them. The Hogen rebellion of 1156 helps to bring about the end of the Heian period. It pits a former emperor against his half-brother, who currently reigns, as well as two brothers of the Fujiwara clan who each support these rival claims. Their disputes lead to an all-out war in the Kyoto region, which ends in a bloody victory for the forces of the sitting emperor, Go Shirakawa. But perhaps more importantly, it temporarily removes the Fujiwara clan from the center of power, as well as the Tachibana, and puts the two remaining great families, the Minamoto and Taira samurai clans, on a collision course. This leads to another war only 3 years later, the Heiji Rebellion of 1159. In this conflict, the Minamoto abduct the now cloistered Emperor Go Shirakawa and the young Emperor Nijo. But the Taira clan regroup and defeat the Minamoto, consolidating power and becoming the de facto rulers of Japan for a generation. The Heian period comes to an end in 1185 CE with what is known as the Genpei War, the climax of the samurai clan rivalries. The Taira and Minamoto clans break the country apart in a civil war. 7 years before, the Taira had purged the entire government of those not loyal to their clan. This touches off the hostilities, which begin with the Battle of Uji in 1180. The Taira pursue a fleeing Prince Mochihito, the favorite of the Minamoto, and catch him at the Uji River. It is said that Ashikaga Tadatsuna, the young general of the Taira clan, declares his name and lineage from the front line before leading the charge that breaks his foes. Minamoto no Yoramasa takes an arrow in the elbow in his defense of the escaping prince and, while the battle still rages, commits a seppuku that is admired for generations. The Taira finally capture the prince and execute him, committing themselves to all-out war in their attempt to seize power. But the Taira are not to hold on to power for much longer. These are dark years for Japan. The conflict is only interrupted by a severe drought and famine in 1181, to resume 2 years later with even greater ferocity. The samurai clan factions each build shifting alliances with less powerful clans and use scheming royals, who often betray them, as the faces of the conflict. Battles are fought over the control of the imperial regalia, for he who wears it has that much better claim to the throne. The Taira's base of power is the inland sea, and much of their military might is in their navy. The Minamoto are beaten in nearly every battle at sea. But then comes the Battle of Dan no Ura in the narrow straits of Shimonoseki. The tides, which favor the Taira at the outset, favor the ships of the Minamoto later on. And with a crucial defection made during the heat of battle, the daring, generations-long bid of the Taira to rule Japan comes to a sudden end. This era is well documented, both with archival court records and government reports, as well as theatrical epics about the exploits of the samurai warriors. Many of the most well-known kabuki and no performance works are set in this era. A large body of literary works also exist of this time, known as gunki monogatari, or war stories, examples such as the Tale of the Heike, the Tale of the Hogen, and Tale of the Disturbance at Heiji, describe not only the historical battles, but also the diplomacy and betrayals, the motivations of historical figures, and the details of their daily lives. The 13th century marks the beginning of military rule, with the rise of Minamoto no Yoritomo and the Kamakura Shogunate. But the emergence of modern Japan is also where the focus of this channel ends. The details of the Shogunate eras of Japan have been well covered elsewhere. The study of early Japan has always been immensely challenging, not only because of the acidic soils and the deeply held traditions, but also because they came so late to writing. While certain details of their oral traditions have been proven by discoveries and the development of new technologies, others have been contradicted. Only in the last few generations have first archaeology, and now the studies of linguistics and genetics, allowed the world to better understand the origins of the people of the rising sun.